Hi and welcome to this Pi Live Q&A huddle. I am delighted to be joined today by Tony Clark, who's the Senior Research Manager at IELTS. Tony, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to hear a bit more about your research, which I think sounds really interesting. It's looking at, from a PhD level, how students, international students, cope in an academic environment after they've taken their IELTS test. But first of all, a bit more about you first. What do you do at Cambridge English when you're not researching?
Thanks, Amy. So my job is Senior Research Manager at IELTS. So I work with a multidisciplinary team across the IELTS partnership and across different departments at Cambridge English. Our job is to basically provide research that supports the IELTS test in all kinds of different ways. Our overall goal is to meet the needs of IELTS test users. So it could be candidates, it could be universities, or any other stakeholders, help them understand what the scores mean, for example. That's part of my job. If I give you an example of a project I'm working on at the moment, I'm conducting research about the IELTS Indicator test, which I'll touch on a little bit later on. But what I basically need to do is find...
I should just say, for those watching, IELTS Indicator is what you brought out promptly to help institutions test remotely.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in response to the pandemic, this was produced. So my job was to find out, what were student experiences of that, examiner experiences of that. Is there anything that can be improved? And all of that goes into our decision making about IELTS in the future. And also other things related to the pandemic. Obviously, that's made us all very busy at the moment. So how can we help students prepare for exams in an online environment? That would all be normally done in a classroom, so I'm trying to find new ways of letting them do that. And also examiners themselves. So a project I'm working on at the moment is helping examiners when they don't get the kind of face-to-face sessions that they used to have for training. So I'm helping them make sure they're properly supported, basically.
And what were you doing before you worked with IELTS and Cambridge English?
I was doing a PhD at Bristol University, so it was about IELTS, but it wasn't just the IELTS test. So I was basically looking into Chinese and Japanese students who've taken IELTS. I went out to China for 6 months and conducted research there, looking at test preparation courses, speaking to students and teachers. I was in Japan for a couple of months doing the same thing, and then the really important part of the study was catching up with Chinese and Japanese students in the UK. So these were people who were doing master's courses, for example, and I wanted to find out how they were getting on. So I focused on writing, because we know academic writing is not easy for anyone. And I wanted to see, how they were coping. They'd all done well on IELTS, and they were actually all doing well on their master's courses. It's a tricky thing for, as I said, for everyone. But most of the students I spoke to were coping. IELTS seemed to set them up for a pretty good start. And after that, it's up to them, really.
Really interesting. And so why did you choose to do this new PhD then in the academic English in particular?
Well, it was in response to my own experiences and what I'd seen. So I was a teacher before I became a researcher. I was abroad for 8 years.
Where were you?
I was in Hungary, Italy, Morocco, then Japan. So quite different countries, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was good. And working for the British Council in some of those places. So it was a really good experience. But a big part of my job was test preparation. So my job was to get students ready for IELTS, basically, and I realised, it's a pretty challenging thing. In Japan, my role was kind of IELTS test preparation instructor. So we had a 5-week intensive course. Students would come in. We'd give them as much help as we could so they could, take the test. But I always felt after they'd taken their test and they went to study in the UK or Australia or wherever they were going, it's hard not to lose touch with them. And I wanted to know, were they okay, basically? How are they doing? So that's where the idea for this PhD came from. I wanted to understand what happens to students beyond the test. So I came back to the UK, did that PhD, and then ended up working as part of IELTS.
And obviously, some of your findings, I presume, will filter back to the way the test continues to develop.
Yeah, exactly. That's a big reason why they hired me. It's because it's good for IELTS to know how every part of the test is functioning. So as I said, I focused on writing. That's obviously a key part, and IELTS really tests writing quite thoroughly. It's one of the most important skills. The reason for that is it is one of the hardest.
Yeah.
It is one of the hardest. I think it is, and not just for Chinese and Japanese students. It's hard for native English speakers as well, writing in academic English. Don't you think?
I think so. Yeah. I was just thinking about my written French.
Is it
Nowhere near as good as my spoken French. And did you find any nuances, though, in terms of nationalities? Were there some nationalities where you might consider instructing them in a different way to be able to learn to pass the IELTS test?
I think it does depend on responding to the local context. So Japanese students, for example, they needed a lot of help with, the productive skills. Not because they weren't good at them. I think they just needed the practice of speaking or writing. But if you were in a European context, you might find that's the other way around. And if you were somewhere else similarly, you'd have to adapt again. So yeah, I do think it depends where students come from. Although it's hard to say because there's individual things to consider as well.
Mm. And in general, then, how would you be able to characterise, if you don't mind, on behalf of IELTS, how IELTS has responded to COVID-19 as an organisation?
Yeah, well, I actually think I'm quite proud of the way it has responded. So it came up with the indicator test, as you said at the start. That's a really tricky situation. People needed secure online language tests, and all the test centres were closed. What they did with Indicator, they managed to get it up and running very quickly. They kept a human examiner, which some of the newer tests, they don't have that. But I think it's really important. So for Indicator, they talked to an examiner like we're talking now. And that was based on considerable research to make sure the scores were comparable to before, to make sure the whole experience was as kind of close to the face-to-face as it could be. I also liked the way IELTS was very honest and open about Indicator. They said to people, this is not a 100% secure test, it's just an indication, and you have to take an IELTS test down the line. Not all test providers were like that, especially some of the newer ones. They'll make claims about their test being secure, but I would have my doubts. So a big thing that IELTS does is trying to maintain trust. Now I speak to university staff and admissions officers quite a lot, and they often say to me, we trust IELTS, and that means a lot. So I like that. And also there was other ways we responded. The test centres had to close a lot of them, but now they've reopened in many places, and they've set them up in a kind of, I suppose you'd call it a COVID secure way, and that's following global guidelines, but also local regulations. So the reason they've done that is to give an element of test security. So test takers can go there, we can say it's a secure result, but they're not, close together with other candidates. So overall, safety is the most important thing. That's students and staff working in these centres. So, yeah, I feel happy with the way IELTS has responded to the crisis, although it's a big challenge.
It feels like you're quite close to the student journey, obviously through your research. What What concerns you most about COVID and the impact on student learners?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I suppose what happened here is demand kind of outstripped supply. There's demand for rigorous English language testing, and because of the crisis, we were struggling with it. The world was struggling with it, and what that has led to is some universities and colleges have accepted test results that they would never have accepted before. Some of these newer tests that I mentioned, and they tend to be tech-driven rather than assessment-driven. And I'm not convinced they properly assess the skills that candidates need for university. So, for example, in IELTS, you get an hour of reading pretty academic texts, and then you get 2 written essays, which are fairly academic in nature. And as I said, you speak to an actual examiner. In some of these newer tests, you've got very limited testing of the productive skills in particular. And that worries me a lot. The impact on students worries me, basically, because they might start these courses having got the scores, from a new test, and it could have all kind of impact on their mental health if they're struggling. Who's going to support these students if they've not got the language proficiency? Unis at the moment are struggling with money themselves. Are they really going to be able to provide sufficient support? That worries me. Also, a lot of these students will come from cultures where it would be shameful to admit you're not managing, or to go back home to your family and say, I'm not coping. And also there's the reputational damage. If these unis are having lots of students who are not managing, they might spread that message around. So I suppose it makes me think of the kind of economic theory about supply and demand and accepting imperfect substitutes. So in a time of crisis, you might accept an imperfect substitute. The problem is with language testing, it's such high stakes. Do you really want an imperfect substitute that doesn't do what is a basic requirement of a language test in a university context, which is to make sure students will have the skills and ability they need to succeed? I think we'd have to think very carefully about that.
Yeah, but do you think this is a conversation that admissions officers are having in small Zoom rooms, huddled together? I mean, do you think people are aware that this is a potential risk?
I think some of them are. I talk to these guys quite a lot, and they're very keen to find out. I think some of them are bound by what they feel they have to do. They need to get the students coming in, so they accept these tests and they think it's only temporary. We're going to go back to the trusted tests beforehand, the ones that are built on research. Others, I think, they don't have that awareness. Now, it might be in this country or abroad, but for those people, I like to talk to them and say, look, be very careful about your choices here, because the consequences could be quite severe. It made me think of a driving test. Because of this whole pandemic, driving test centres have had to close, obviously. But you wouldn't have an online driving test and then people can go on and drive on the roads whenever they want. That would be very dangerous. I think there is a comparison to be made between that and
Wow, I mean, this is all newsworthy stuff for me, my journalist hat on, but I guess we will have to wait and see. Quickly, we're running out of time, but what's next for IELTS from here, and how will you continue to adapt, given that we are still living in very uncertain COVID-19 times?
In short, we're going to be very, very busy. Continuing to adapt, as you said, basically. We need to keep meeting the needs of these test users. We need to think about how to be as flexible as possible, given the circumstances. I think this pandemic has changed testing forever, but the basic principles that higher education needs from testing are the same. They need to know that students are up to standard for their own sake, if nothing else. We can't sacrifice quality for availability and convenience on this. So our job is to continue to do that. We think about test impact. That's the main thing. Validity, reliability, fairness, but test impact is the really big one. AI should be to improve all these things, not to destroy them.
Okay, Thank you. That's a great note to end on. We are going to be continuing this conversation in a virtual roundtable right now. So if you are watching this live, there's going to be a link right below. Let's continue this conversation. And thanks for joining us. Thanks, Tony, for your time.
Thanks for having me.